For just the third time in history, women now outnumber men in the workforce, or at least that's the story. As of 2 months ago, this gap stood at around 100,000 more jobs held by women, and last month that difference grew to 150,000, which, in the grand scheme of things of the national workforce, is basically a rounding error. But the fact that this is so close at all is a sign of some major changes in the labor market that have really only been seen before in 2008 and 2019. So, maybe not a good sign. Now, by itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. Some women want a career and some men want to be stay-at-home parents. So if these non-traditional gender roles become more accepted and end up splitting the workforce almost perfectly 50-50, that is basically the perfect outcome, right? Except of course, that's not what's actually happening here. Besides the small little inconvenient detail that every news outlet reporting on this issue so far has either been maliciously or incompetently misunderstanding what the data actually means, there is still a much bigger issue. For a number of reasons, this kind of statistical reversal is not really an indication of women getting ahead or even men falling behind. It's instead normally the sign of some relatively serious issues across the entire job market, which means it's only fair to ask if the same thing is happening here again.
Women now outnumber men in the workforce, helping fuel the rise of the stay-at-home boyfriend.
I've been a stay-at-home dad for 13 years.
And I've been a stay-at-home dad for approximately 8 years.
Officially became a stay-at-home dad.
Men are missing from the American workforce. New government data shows more men are out, more women are in, many of them working in fields traditionally dominated by guys.
A record number of people in the U.S. have more than one job. That's according to the Labor Department.
And women appear to be leading that trend.
Okay, so I guess the first thing we need to get out of the way is, how is this claim even possibly true? Anybody who even takes a cursory glance at the actual numbers might see some pretty obvious problems with this statement. Sure, the labor force participation rate for men has infamously been falling for a long time now, and the participation rate for women is much closer to its all-time peak. But there is still a 10% point difference between them in favor of men. According to the most recent BLS data, 66.8% of men aged 16 and over were participating in the labor force, while only 56.6% of women were. Now, to be fair, participating in the labor force does include people who are looking for work, but not actually holding down a job. It takes everybody in these groups and divides them by the total population, outside of a few narrow exceptions which we will discuss later. But even if somehow unemployment only applied to men, that still wouldn't explain the disconnect between these numbers and this claim. If we wanted to make it even more simple, we can just look at the BLS's own data and see plain as day that in June of this year, there were 84.9 million men employed in this country, and only 77.4 million employed women. So, when these articles said that women now outnumber men in the workforce, what they actually meant was, well, men still outnumbered women by more than 7 million. So, this raises the pretty obvious question of, were they just straight up lying? Well, no. They were doing something much worse. They were either misunderstanding or outright misrepresenting the data. The government effectively runs two separate job surveys every month. One asks businesses how many names were on their payrolls, and the other asks actual households who is working. What has actually flipped slightly in favor of women is the number of payroll jobs held by these genders, which might sound like exactly the same thing as the number of people employed, but it isn't, because people can have multiple jobs, and holding down multiple jobs is quite common as a bit of foreshadowing, especially when they are struggling to get by. Alright, to show you what I mean here, take 10 men and 10 women. 2 people from each group are retired, 3 of the women and 1 of the men are stay-at-home parents, and sure, for good measure, let's say 1 of the men is out of work entirely. That leaves 5 working women and 6 working men, which is actually roughly indicative of the actual US population, where men do still indeed outnumber women in the workforce. But now let's say that these 2 women and 1 of these men pick up an extra job to help pay their bills. Well, now, between the 2 groups, men have claimed 7 jobs and women have also claimed 7 jobs. So even though there were more men employed, both men and women are working in the same number of jobs, which is, again, basically exactly what is happening here. Women are statistically more likely to hold multiple separate jobs, partially because they tend to favor flexible schedules that can work around other commitments, but also because they are overrepresented in fields that run on shift work, and they typically just have less stable employment, especially if they are moving into the workforce involuntarily. Men, on the other hand, are also more likely to have more work without a typical payroll, because they are running a small personal business as a sole proprietorship, and well, yeah, also because they are overrepresented in gig work. This still counts as having a job, obviously, but doesn't count as a regular payroll, because of course in contract work like this, there is no payroll. The point is, the payroll number just isn't counting what these reporters think it is counting. And look, the misrepresentation of this statistic is really disappointing for two separate reasons. The first is that a lot of these articles just took a cool-sounding data point, failed completely to explain what it meant, and used it entirely to justify whatever story they already wanted to write. In just a beautiful encapsulation of everything wrong with reporting these days, one outlet used the data to declare the man-child stay-at-home boyfriend an official economic trend, and another outlet used the same figure to support that men were all becoming communists. Again, maybe you personally agree with one and/or both of these ideas, but the point is this figure, while it sounds cool, isn't saying what they think it is saying. It's not great, but it gets worse. Because, well, the second reason this is so disappointing is that even with a proper understanding of what this data actually means, it's still really important. Men do still technically outnumber women in the workforce, but this payroll reversal is a real statistical phenomenon, and one that has really only shown up in not the greatest of economic times. So I guess it's worth asking, why is this happening now? Well, a few reasons. The first one is honestly that, well yeah, even though it's not yet a majority, more men really just are choosing to stay at home. The trend of the stay-at-home dad is much more socially accepted today than it was even just a decade ago, and by Pew's most recent count, dads make up almost 1 in 5 of America's stay-at-home parents. Women have also had a higher rate of university attainment than men for a while now. As of last year, nearly half of all employed women held a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to about 42% of employed men. So it stands to reason that a lot of them would choose to actually put that degree to work by, well, working while their partner stayed home. For what it's worth, as a personal anecdote, my wife makes more than I do, as she works a real job, and I have fallen into the prototypical 21st century insufferable influencer/trophy husband role. Now, obviously, that is the best case scenario to explain this trend. But let's be honest, most households these days really need 2 people generating an income in order to survive. And yeah, in 2/3 of married couples with kids, both parents already work. So, another major driver is that a lot of these men have started opting out of these traditional commitments, including the workforce, entirely. This means that in order to survive, they either rely on their parents, their partner, government benefits, or some combination of all three. For young men, this group has been given the name NEET, not in education, employment, or training, a classification that now covers roughly 1 in 10 young men. Among young adults, 20% of men are still living in a parent's home, compared to 15% of women. We have already made a whole video about the causes of these trends, and the TLDR is that it has largely been the result of people effectively seeing that they will never get ahead through traditional employment. If working 40 hours a week provides no meaningful benefit over just sitting at home, then a lot of people who are falling behind are making the logical decision to fall behind in comfort. Now, this has impacted men more so than women, partially because of the traditional expectations that are placed on men to be the breadwinners. But again, already a whole video about that. Even still, this is a long, slow drift that has been playing out over decades. The share of prime working age men participating in the workforce peaked all the way back in 1954, and it has been sliding lower across most of the decades since. So, a slow multi-decade slide at the same time that women were entering the workforce en masse due to a combination of necessity and empowerment did help to close the gap. But what it can't explain is the very steep flip that just happened, and has only happened 2 other times in history. So it's time to learn how many works to find out why this badly misrepresented statistic might legitimately be a recession indicator. This video is sponsored by Monarch. If you have ever tried to track your money across multiple apps and accounts, you know how easy it is to lose sight of the big picture. Monarch is a private, ad-free personal finance platform that syncs all your accounts from 13,000 plus institutions into one clean dashboard. What I like about Monarch is that it does not make you try to obsess over every transaction. It separates your fixed and flexible spending, keeps everything organized with your own rules and categories, and when something unusual happens, it explains what changed in plain English. You stay aware without being overwhelmed. My partner and I actually use the shared view for our monthly check-ins. We both see the same dashboard, the same goals, the same recurring bills. It has cut out most of the awkward money conversations because there are no surprises. Monarch also tracks your net worth over time and gives you clear payoff timelines for savings and paying down debt, so you can see whether you are actually making progress instead of just hoping you are. And because you are the customer and not the product, Monarch is completely ad-free with bank-level encryption. No ads, no data selling. Try Monarch for yourself. Scan the QR code on screen or use the link in the description, and use code HMW50 to get 50% off your first year. Okay, so women entering the workforce and men opting out of it has helped to narrow this gap over the years. But a full inversion is usually the sign of something going not quite right in the wider economy. So, the second big pressure flipping these scales is that women typically have roles that are more secure in an economic downturn, especially in fields like healthcare. According to Indeed's Hiring Lab, America added 1.2 million new jobs between 2024 and early 2026, with 2/3 of those being new jobs going to women. That was largely because basically all of our recent workforce growth has been in healthcare, as our country slowly transitions into being a giant glorified aged care facility with a little bit of data center construction tacked on the side. That is barely even an exaggeration, by the way. Over the last 12 months, healthcare and social assistance added more jobs than the entire American economy did on net, because everything else combined actually shrank. Care jobs are also much harder to hand over to the clankers or lay off in a downturn. And there are more people getting older and more reliant on that care every single year. People over the age 65 now outnumber children in 11 of 50 states, up from just 3 in 2020. And that's after COVID did a bit of statistical trimming. So yeah, there's plenty of positions available to people looking after the elderly and sick. Again, we have already done that video. But on the other hand, something like construction, which is still about 89% male, is incredibly cyclical. If the economy isn't building, there just naturally isn't stable demand for that work. Now, of course, men can have healthcare jobs too, but nursing, admin, and care work are heavily female-dominated fields. Registered nurses, for example, are still about 87% women. Doctors are closer to a 60-40 split in favor of men, but they only make up a small share of the healthcare workforce, about 1 million physicians spread across more than 18 million healthcare jobs. Additionally, statistically speaking, healthcare jobs also tend to be shift-based, and it's much more likely for a nurse to pick up shifts at 2 or 3 different facilities, each with its own payroll, than it is for an engineer to somehow work at 3 separate firms. This again means that women are likely to hold more payrolls without there actually being more women working. Now, as for the wider effects on the workforce, the reality is that women have spent decades being actively encouraged to go take on roles in typically male-dominated fields like engineering, finance, or even the trades. But there has never really been an equivalent push for men to move into typically female-dominated fields like nursing, primary care, social work, or early childhood learning. Betsy Stevenson, an economist at the University of Michigan, said in an interview that we have to help men understand that they can do caregiving roles and stay masculine. Now this is a noble ambition and all, but there are a few reasons for the split, and one of them is simply that these fields don't typically pay as much. Laura Ulrich, an economic researcher, put it as plainly as an economist can. If you're seeing a shift towards more female employment, all else equal, you would see a shift towards lower wages. Now, as a quick little interlude, this isn't always true, and a lot of healthcare roles pay extremely well, even outside of the ones that require medical school. But even still, for better or worse, men have been apprehensive about making that move. Although, as a side note, the men who do go into these fields often enjoy a good amount of job security and some suspiciously fast career progression. Sociologists have been calling this the glass escalator for more than 30 years, and male registered nurses today earn about 25% more per week than their female colleagues. Part of it is just a practical reality. A lot of this work is quite physically demanding, so having a bigger guy around to do the literal heavy lifting is genuinely useful in many of these settings. Even still though, despite this very interesting little tangent, most people don't go into healthcare or age support for the paycheck, and men are typically more financially focused when picking a career path. And well, to play devil's advocate once again, the third reason that women are holding more jobs than men is just desperation. In a traditional single-income family, if the breadwinning man of the household loses his job in one of those more precarious fields, his wife or girlfriend might need to go out and take on a job, where they would typically have been a stay-at-home spouse. Economists literally call this the added worker effect. Studies tracking laid-off workers found that a wife picking up extra work ends up covering about a quarter of her husband's lost income. In plain English, as an example, say you lost a decent job, and your wife goes from staying at home to a part-time role at the local clinic, plus a weekend shift somewhere else while you look for a new primary job. Your household budget is still going to be in serious trouble, But on paper, your family just went from 1 payroll to 2. This is pretty much what we saw in 2008, when men bore almost 80% of the recession's early job losses thanks to their overrepresentation in construction and manufacturing. The same thing happened again at the end of 2019 as the result of slowly losing traditional jobs in manufacturing and mining and replacing them with more female-dominated service roles. Stevenson, the same professor from a minute ago, told NPR back then that she felt very strongly that women would still hold the majority a year later. Of course, a couple months later we were hit with the pandemic, which had a bigger impact on service fields instead, which meant that, that prediction did not age well. So yeah, as much as it would be nice to say that this is a statistic of empowered girl bosses, or even a story of lazy dudes who would rather smoke cones and play video games, the actual story is that the workforce is getting shafted, but certain corners of the workforce are getting shafted slightly less. Someone holding 1 job is usually in a much better position than someone juggling 4 of them, because in most fields, the only reason to do that is that 1 or 2 jobs just isn't enough to survive on. The Fed's own researchers profiled this group and found that they average almost 50 hours a week of work across their jobs, and that for the first time ever, about half of them have college degrees. It sounds bad, but it gets worse. Remember when I said about 10 minutes ago that the labor force counts all people looking for or actively engaged in work outside of a few narrow exceptions? Well, there is one other statistical anomaly that men in particular generally turn to in hard economic times: the military. Despite being a very real job, the BLS does not count active duty military personnel as part of the regular workforce, and despite getting a paycheck, their payrolls don't count either. Typically, when people, and especially young men, can't find work anywhere else, the military is happy to welcome them with open arms and a steady wage. And well, yep, as of 2 months ago, military recruitment has actually hit a 15-year high. Every single military branch met or beat its goal last year, and the Army filled this year's entire quota about 4 months early. Now, I suppose it's possible that young people are just feeling really patriotic about our on-again, off-again special military operation in Iran. But it's also possible that people are signing up because it's the easiest way left to get some financial stability. The Pentagon's own compensation reviews literally treat the civilian job market as a core recruiting variable, where finding a job gets harder for you, enlistment gets easier for them. Now, I know this probably isn't a shock to you, and even the Army is honestly pretty open about this. Their own director of market intelligence, yes, the Army has one of those, explained the recent recruiting boom by pointing out that job openings have been falling, and that we're postured well to compete in that arena. This means that there is a statistically meaningful group of men out there holding down what are effectively payroll jobs that just don't get captured in this comparison. And yes, of course, before the comments say it, there are women in the military as well, but it is a very male-dominated employer. Women make up about 18% of the 1.3 million people on active duty. If these jobs were counted normally by the BLS, men would still comfortably claim more payrolls than women by some margin. So yeah, these claims are wrong, they're wrong for bad reasons, and even by the narrow definition that they are correct, it's really not the good news or the particular brand of bad news they are trying to sell. It's all a little bit dumb, but it gets even dumber. Because even in the industry that started this whole layoff trend, the companies driving the cuts have ended up hiring back the exact same jobs all over again. So go and watch this video next to find out what all of this was actually for. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.